Thank you for having me. Thank you to all the organizers and the technical team. You will hear some thoughts from me, but I feel they will simply be sort of thoughts incredibly aligned with, but substantially less well articulated than TJ's and Maya and Ruben's thoughts. So coming after you both, you three, is humbling and borderline intimidating. So my name is Lucia. I'm a curator, and as you just said, in fact, I work at the intersection of art and the environment. So facing as we do today, and nobody needs me to say this, but in Kim Stanley Robinson's words, this would go without saying, except that it needs saying. Facing then, as we do today, an asynchronous, differentially distributed, and completely dysfunctional coming to consciousness with climate breakdown. The questions we are thinking about today have never been a theoretical hypothesis, but a very real and very tangible material thing. There are estimations being made that are in effect already able to predict how much of this planet will be rendered uninhabitable by humans in the coming decades. And this is not in the future either. There are places that have already been rendered uninhabitable to most human and more than human beings. And as TJ has pointed out at the beginning, in many places, the climate apocalypse began some 500 years ago. So it is easy to feel rage or grief and really rather incredibly irresponsible to both be sort of blindingly optimistic or hopeful, or to quote unquote give up nihilistically, sitting as I might be, and many of us might be, in the comfort of a house in London or in some other place not at the front line of climate change, climate breakdown even. Spending any amount of time looking really directly at this, it becomes unintelligible to reckon with how it is possible that we are not all of us, dropping everything else we're doing and realizing that this, climate justice and environmental balance, are the defining challenges of our generation, and that this is what we will be measured against by the generations that will follow. So these are not abstract questions, and not at all. And to that end, perhaps, given that we are in an art context, it might be worth asking ourselves what, if any, the role the arts might play, may be, or may turn out to be. And I was incredibly privileged to end up sitting on a panel with Dr. Yuba Sakona, the vice chair of the IPCC, just a few days ago. And we spoke about this thing emerged, this idea of a crisis of the imagination. And we kind of went into that a little bit and realized this crisis is not a lack of imagination, but rather a monoculturalization of imagination. So it's with some kind of notion of some regenerative or permacultural plurality of imaginations that I'm asking this question about the role of art in the face of climate breakdown. So I really, believe that art has a part to play. And this first part of my considerations might be sort of borderline incredibly simplistic, but I like to sort of break things down from the very kind of simple bits. I believe it has a role to play, not because I may foolishly think about it as any kind of quote solution. Obviously, nothing is. All of climate balance and justice responses will continue to feel to us, at least in the short term, like countless situated, interconnected micro responses that might work. And if we think about sort of what systems theoreticians tend to say about that anyways, any system that works or functions at scale begins as a much smaller prototype that then multiplies or scales up. And I think actually scaling up is an incredibly dangerous thing. But nevertheless, any system that works at scale begins as a smaller system. So having spent some time working in collaboration with organizations and individuals who focus on the environment, I realized that the expectations of what art can do tend to be high, but actually pretty vague. And they also tend to remain quite narrowly focused on one particular role that art can play of what I think are many. So in most cases, art, or maybe even the arts at large, are thought of under the general and somewhat elusive notion of making data intelligible or beautiful or powerful, or at any rate kind of enfleshed. We talk about spreading awareness as if public understanding of science could make these giant hegemonic and interconnected systems make some kind of instant U-turn on almost everything, which is pretty much what we need right about now. So since then, spending all this time sort of mostly outside of the art context, but talking about art, I've started to pull together ideas around what art is for, what it's perceived to be for, what it can do, and how it can focus its efforts towards environmental responsibility. And as a kind of direct consequence of that, what kind of organizational structures and institutions can support that kind of work. So beginning from that very sort of direct art idea of art as public awareness or as mobilization, how to make the complex sensible. So we might be thinking about questions around public engagement or public dissemination. In that case, our sort of measuring tools might be how many people does this work reach. We might think about simplifying what is scientific or complex data. And to that end, we might ask questions such as, well, how much public understanding has this piece of this kind of cultural artifact contributed towards reaching? Or we might be thinking about something much more emotional, like mobilizing hearts and soul. And in that case, the measurements are actually kind of vague. And the question that sort of remains burning after that is, what is the follow-up? What happens after you've moved someone to tears about environmental injustice, for example? What's at stake in that moment of interaction? Now, I'm about to cite only works that I've been involved with or am involved with at the moment. And so in terms of kind of public mobilization and mobilizing hearts and souls, I obviously can immediately cite the work of Rugile Baržiukaitė, Vaiva Grainyti, and Dina Lapelita, which we presented as the Lithuanian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2019. It's an opera. The singers are these beachgoers. You watch the opera from above as though you were kind of looking somewhere between the sort of Google satellite and being down at stage level. You're watching this and these songs from the cast members, from the characters, unfolding as they perform what is actually a ritual of a kind of everyday life, not for everybody, but a kind of everyday life. And as their mundane and almost unworthy of notice thoughts and conversations and discussions emerge as song, something much more unifying and much more subtle emerges, which is some kind of occasional perception of some kind of climate disturbance. And then very quickly the characters return to their own activities. And so at the time I interpreted this, and I don't have time to go into how I interpret it today, but at the time I interpreted this as a piece that brought very much to some kind of enfleshed understanding the cognitive incapacity that we have to wrap our heads around something as vast and as distributed and as unequally distributed as the climate crisis. Another form of art as mobilization, and here we sort of shift what public is the notion of art participating in forms of grassroots resistance and self-organization. I'm citing here the Caribbean Film Collective because although the sort of output of this 35-strong collective, all members but one Aboriginal Australians from the Northern Territory, even though the sort of direct output with which we as an art kind of environment interact the most is the commission of a series of films, those films themselves are part of a process that has to do with reclaiming forms of land and forms of belonging and forms of ancestral presence that have been threatened, eradicated, and impinged upon in violent ways by the settler colonial state. I will get to that later, actually. Another way of looking at forms of art and their relationship to climate breakdown is this question of the prototype. Over the decades, many experiments have indeed begun and flourished, sheltered by a kind of art context that, unlike the frameworks of current scientific research, allowed them to wander into an endeavor without the necessary notion of the expected end result, which is one of the things that scientists tend to complain about needing to have in order to secure funding often. or even experiments that are allowed to fail, which is an incredibly important thing to actually be able to do and recognize. And so one of the great privileges of the artistic umbrella is that it affords all kinds of possibilities under a set of parameters that is fairly undefined and thusly fairly flexible. And I am not saying that there are no gatekeepers, because there are plenty. But another thing that working as art can do in this context, which can be quite useful in places, is to pass as art. That is to say, to leverage those points of access, of connection, and of agency that any creative field might have, that might be different to those available to scientific or political or activist or advocacy organizations towards a common set of goals. The idea here is that by identifying something as an artwork, you may not undertake the same trajectory from concept to funding to delivery that other fields might have at their disposal. And in a kind of moment of trying many, many things and seeing what sticks and seeing what works, then why not try that too? So I'm mentioning here cooking sections work, spatial practitioners, and the work Climavore really seeks to think about our consumption of food as part of a kind of circular and regenerative methodology for producing and consuming food, and really think about how can we sort of both react to a changing climate, but also by changing our food habits actually positively impact certain kinds of landscapes. And you're looking here at an oyster table full of filter feeders in tidal zones on the Isle of Skye, where the artists are working with chefs, with local salmon farmers, with local politicians and local stakeholders to see if the economy of the entire Isle of Skye, or the sort of the functioning of the entire Isle of Skye, might be able to be pivoted away from very climate intensive salmon farming and fish farming through to the kinds of farming that actually functions as carbon sinks, as filter feeders tend to clean up polluted waters and so on. Another prototype that we can look at is sort of art organization in the shape of a kind of para-institutional project. Here, Fernando Garcia-Dori's Inland, which really looks very systemically and systematically at the workings of the art environment in order to leverage that and leverage support towards supporting pastoralist cultures of the north of Spain and elsewhere. Then we come to something a little bit more sort of fuzzy, I suppose, art for deep time. In this case, it's a little bit more about how we participate in shaping minds of the future through culture at large, how we might speculate and dreams, and what visions do we birth in that relationship. I am reminded of a conversation that I had with a colleague in which we had a slight disagreement as to whether science fiction writers predicted the way that technology would look like today, or rather whether technology in the shape it is today was created and designed by a number of very sort of plastic brains at the time of reading, which is children, right? So it's really in this kind of production of imaginations and this plurality of imaginations that we also have to remember that the intergenerational relationships that then might worlds somewhere in the future might be at stake as well. And then I suppose that might be a kind of message in a bottle towards the future, but then we also can look at the deep past. So I've spoken before of the correlation between passages in the Song of Songs, for example, or in Sumerian poetry, and the transmission of human to human knowledge around human date palm fertilization processes, the backbone of Mesopotamian civilizations for millennia. So Sumerian, ancient Greek poetry, and so many others, but just to name two examples, figure, if you read them and decode them under that standpoint, as memory palaces for agricultural and pre-agricultural knowledge. And all of a sudden, that made me really interested in the relation between what we deem as abstraction, so ritual, myth, poetry, art, visual art, the performative arts, and so on, and the material, sort of material, embodied, tangible, ontological things. What is the relationship that binds these? This abstraction that emerges over deep time And then this material physical actuality that we experience phenomenologically as we experience the seasons, the growth of plants, or disturbances in the climate. And the hypothesis here is that the arts have always held the deep time cultural memory of our relationship with the planet, of our relationship with one another and with more than human beings. And if we fast forward to the 80s and 90s and we think about experiments in long-term nuclear waste warning messages, we see the sort of emergence of these hybrid groups of researchers that are trying to think, how do you encode the knowledge across deep time, 10,000 years from now, that this particular site holds nuclear waste underfoot. And you see this really interesting emergence of a group of semioticians and anthropologists who actually suggest oral history and oral tradition. And so one of the intuitions here, and something that I'm really sort of working on at the moment, really has to do with whether we may kind of make a slight error in imagining technology as something encoded in hardware, and then spend all this time and money kind of creating smaller and more and faster hardware, when actually, whilst actually at the same time forgetting that art in its most expanded sense, including ritual, may have been actually the most resilient technology that we may have ever known how to come up with. And if we fast forward again, another work that I'm involved with is not an artwork. Tabitha Rezer is very keen on repeating this. Tabitha is an artist. Amakaba will be a center for the sort of preservation and experiencing of ancestral knowledge around the earth, food, the sky, and astrology and astronomy sited in the forests of French Guiana. So what is then the work? What is the work? I'm a curator. What is the work? I suppose my work, or the sort of my self-imposed homework, is about trying to find these organizational structures, these institutional and networked contexts that can support these different kinds of art and planet by being as adherent as possible to the necessities of the projects themselves. And I'm showing two really random images about trees here, also to make the point that so to sort of briefly speak about the General Ecology Project, which was founded about 3 years ago in quite a biomorphic kind of way, to try and think about a forest, in a tree in a forest system. So a project that manifests the sort of discursive flourishing of questions around environmental justice and balance, the commissioning of artworks around it, the sort of development of programs around it, whilst at the same time using that very sort of public end of it to simultaneously try to embed, and this is much slower work and it's by no means completed, to embed within the infrastructural roots, I suppose, of an organization. It happened to be the Serpentine, but it was a prototype for anywhere else. Into the roots of an organization, different ways of working, different ways of relating ourselves to our sense of the institution, to its own sense of purpose, its own sense of mission, the way that it assesses its impact, the way that it measures it. And then in a forest system, because in order to do that, it could not remain within the confines of the institution itself, the field of art, and had to become more dependent and interdependent on the kinds of knowledges and skills and time and care that are afforded by other disciplines. And the tree in the gutter on the side is a sort of nod to the emergence of these things in disturbed landscapes and disturbed environments. And so some kind of, I suppose, active but hopeful but active notion that that work can and could be undertaken in compromised places too. And then to conclude, well, these are just some images from a symposium series and research project on more than human consciousness that Filipa Ramos and I have been curating for about 3 years. And these are just some images from various outputs of the General Ecology Project. The one in the center you see is Dedicha presenting an artwork in the context of the environmental organization Julie's Bicycles, a yearly climate conference. So there's also been quite a lot of sort of skills, exchange of skills and exchange of, I suppose, in-kind professional services across all these different organizations. So to conclude, I'm currently also working on Back to Earth, which is an initiative in which we invited kind of a excessive number of artists to propose an artwork that was also simultaneously an environmental campaign or initiative or prototype or intervention. And we began by mapping it on something like this, like what is the relationship of this particular project or proposal to the necessity for it to be visible? Or how much does it dedicate itself to systems in such a way that it is better for it to exist in a much more invisible infrastructural way? What does it ask of the audiences? Does it ask for awareness? And that's it? Does it ask for some kind of participation? And then that map became a little bit maybe too simple, or maybe not. It stopped mapping itself onto the work that we've been doing. And we started to think of it as public systems, places, and speculations. And I will just conclude on these four kind of driving vectors for us. Publics are the sort of definitely the initiatives and the campaigns that look for some kind of public awareness. And we've tried to weave in certain kinds of inter-organizational collaborations that also allow for us to turn that awareness into forms of donation or into kind of very quick follow-up action. Systems are those initiatives, artworks, and campaigns that really want to dedicate themselves to changing a piece of policy or a piece of some kind of infrastructure or something in the curriculum or something like this. And those works are, slow, often invisible, and kind of long running. And success is by no means guaranteed, but we're trying everything possible. Places are campaigns and initiatives that actually already have a sense of their own situatedness, and that much like Amakaba of Tabita Reserve before, or the art residency for ancestors that Caribbean Film Collective is developing, really look at citing themselves into a practice and a process of care for place, for country. And then finally, speculations are those kinds of works that, whether by sort of pointing towards the deep past or pointing towards some kind of deep future, imagine sort of a differential relationship with justice, with balance, with the environment, and with more than human species. I believe that was all I had to say. Thank you.